Hi, everybody, and welcome back to HCD's Mindset, our vidcast about various topics. We're in season 2 now, and our topic for today is about baselines, benchmarks, and other comparisons. Lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. And without further ado, let's start with some introductions about who we are and who HCD is. But first, welcome back to everybody that's been joining us on this journey, and a hearty welcome to those of you who are new. My name is Michelle Niedziela. I am a PhD in behavioral neuroscience and VP of Research and Innovation at HCD Research, and joined by Kathryn.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Kathryn Ambroze. I'm the manager of behavioral and marketing sciences with HCD, and we're really excited to be able to sprinkle in a couple concept topics of our vidcasts into these with the mindset vidcasts, into these with the little interviews, just so that way we can keep on kind of bringing it back a little bit to that season 1 that we had in sharing concepts, but
Knowledge
also
is power.
Yeah, exactly. So that way we can keep sharing what we learn and sharing the, new information as it comes out. So really excited about this. But before we touch on our topic today, let's talk about HCD.
So who is HCD? We are a market research and consumer science research provider, where we look at how consumers interact with communications, products, and other types of stimuli to understand better how they are really perceiving, evaluating, or responding to these sort of things. We use a lot of different approaches. We try to stay most innovative and use the most effective research tools to better understand products, packaging, and communications for consumers. All the things that we do can be done online or in person, and we've done this research all around the world. Wherever you have your consumers, we can get there by plane, train, automobile, or the internet highway. Our sort of big deal is that we use applied consumer neuroscience, which means we use physiological measures of brain activity or other sorts of peripheral activity, also looking at psychology and behavior and emotions, and also your traditional work as well. And we explore all the experiences consumers have from the early stages of exploration that a company might have in developing products and communications, all the way through to validation, where you want to see what's happening in marketing or maybe how the product is performing. So with that, let's move right into today's conversation where you got data, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do with it? Maybe it's survey data, maybe it's EEG data or scientific data of some physiological form. What are we going to do with it? How do we know something from it?
Right, exactly. So it's clearly from what we have shared here, it's really about comparisons, and comparisons are used to really determine and to quantify relationships between different variables that you observe with whatever groups that you're deciding to look at. So, and that could be either comparing, by things by choice or by circumstances that people are exposed to based on that experimental design that you have.
And that's an important point, I think. So, and I think that's kind of exemplified by your picture here that, we have a big fish in a small bowl or a small fish in a big bowl. So it is very relative, right? So when you're making these comparisons, are you comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? And if you are, you can totally compare apples to oranges. You just have to be able to speak to why you're doing that.
Yeah, like why are you talking about fruit in general? So it's, it all comes back to it.
Right.
But yeah, exactly. And I think that through comparisons, you do comparisons also maybe through studies that have already happened in the past. So you have these retroactive studies that you're using to make these comparisons and kind of get an idea of events that maybe have already occurred to see, does your event that you looked at match up with what other people have seen, or are you learning something different? And that kind of helps to get an understanding of really, and give you an example and an examination of the variables that are being presented through that experiment. And
because otherwise, what's the point? Right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really fundamental aspect of doing research is the idea of comparisons.
But surprisingly, we do have situations where we will be talking to a client and they will say they want to collect data on this product. Like, let's say it's a new beverage, right? Mm-hmm. And they say, we want to do consumer research on it. And we say, okay, we can do that. And they say, all right, here's the sample, go forth and measure it. And the question we always have to come back to them is like, okay, that's great. We can do that. We can ask people liking, like, how much do you like that product? How much do you like that drink? But if we don't have something to compare it to, we really don't have a lot to say, right? So you have to have some sort of what we call action standards to be able to say that, okay, people liked it a 6 out of 7. What does that mean in relation to a competitive product? Or what does that mean in relation to how the product was last year, right? Before you made some change. But you have to give it relevance. You have to compare it to something.
So can you just kind of dive a little bit more into what you think an action standard actually is? Is it comparison, or is it what you're kind of using as your groundwork?
So literally what an action standard means is that your product has to meet a certain level in order to move forward. So the action standard is set by saying, in order for us to take action on it, it has to meet this. So either it has to get at least a 6 out of 7 on liking, it has to compare parity, meaning the same, or better than your benchmark. And a benchmark is your competitor. Or maybe it's your internal competitor. Maybe it's your original product from years ago. But you have to say something like, it has to perform the same or better than. And that's like a numerical value.
Right. And I think that ties really nicely with our second bullet here, is because you're using past, present, and to understand the future. And it really does kind of make this continuum that you have of comparisons and keeping things in mind, because like we've kind of touched on already, science is really this evolving creature. So what we have learned from the past, we can still use to help try to make analysis and, drive future research.
While it can seem like you are learning something if you're just measuring the one product, if you don't have something to really compare it to, then it's really hard to say that you've had a successful study, right? So do you have a successful product? Was the study successful? The question is, successful at what? And, what is, that you met the action standard, that you compared, when you were compared to something, you performed better. Or maybe you need to know that you compared worse, because then if you need work, right? You need to improve something, because if you're not getting that 6 out of 7 on a liking scale, then that's important to know. And you need to decide, okay, if 6 is to be good enough, and I'm getting a 5, then what can we do to make it better?
Interesting. And that's really where you get those points of innovation too, is learning how you can make yourself better to get to that point that you set for yourself, that action standard. And again, this is also ties in really nicely with the idea of control. So it's not just controlling your experiment, but having a control within your experiment to really have, again, that comparison.
That's exactly what, in market research or consumer research, in scientific research, you call things control and you call them placebo, and you want to perform better than a placebo, right? You want to perform better than the control, and the control is a situation where you have no product, right? Or no treatment. That's very much the same as an action standard. It's saying that I have to perform better than this to say that we're having any effect at all.
It's a great point. I love this title. We chatted about this title.
It's all about that baseline. So, again, when we think about, like, specifically in physiological research, but I think it can apply to other things as well that might have a time course. A lot of times when we measure, say, an experience with physiology, we have to start from somewhere. And the activity, the stimulus, the exposure that someone has, the reaction that they have that we're trying to measure with physiology is a change from how they were, right?
Right. So you're saying
it has to be measured.
So this is being employed before the experiment happens, a baseline. You're not going to have this collected afterwards or anything like that. It's really that period that you get prior to them being exposed to anything.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because some people, play around with what the idea of baseline means. Sometimes I think that it's really good to have it be the first measure when someone comes in and gets wired up before they're exposed to anything. And some people think that you can maybe collect a lot of data, right? To get an idea of what overall thousands of people have for their heart rate, let's say, and have that as some sort of metric, right?
Interesting. Yeah. So
Yeah,
population metric, essentially.
yeah, a population metric. So we get that question a lot from clients when we want to do physiological research. They'll say, well, do you have a metric to compare it to? And the answer is no, because honestly, individual variability happens so much in physiological data that the best way to do a comparison is not to have a metric of overall general population, but instead have the person act as their own reference.
Yep. That makes sense.
So
yeah.
Everything should be done within. So it's how much they change from their own baseline. So then their baseline is when they're sitting there resting and not doing anything. That's the norm, right? The normal measure. And then if I am to show you a scary movie, right? When you react to that scary movie, that should be a change from your baseline. So if your baseline's here, this is your normal resting state. And then your arousal, your GSR, you have someone jump out, Freddie jumps out in your dream, then like you end up here, right? And so now you see that baseline's here, reaction was here. Is this a significant difference? So you have something, again, to compare it to.
Yeah. So it's really, the baseline is like that evaluation that you have comparing what your baseline is normally to what it is when you're exposed to a stimulus. And that's really where we get our information from. That's really where we're able to really draw more conclusions, is based off of how we analyze those types of comparisons. And
I think, again, like a reason to do it right before we give them any stimulus, like the day they're doing the study, and say not, a month ago or even from a different person, is because you want to have that change from what the state they're in at the day of research.
Makes sense.
If we're thinking like GSR, for example, you can have seasonal changes on how like moisturized your hands are. If it's dead of winter, people tend to have a lot more dryness, right? So you want that baseline not to be a baseline you took in July when they were a lot more sweaty. And so, thinking about that, it's important to have it as a measure from that day.
Yeah. And honestly, also you can think about even just what you ate that day is something that could affect how you are,
coffee,
heart rate is going. Yeah.
I mean, some of that should be also controlled for before they even come in, so sometimes we'll say, so that it doesn't affect the baseline, right?
Right.
That, we're not, because if your normal baseline is here, again, to use visuals, if your normal baseline is here, your baseline on coffee is here, and Freddie jumps out at you here. Well, if we measure you with coffee, the change to Freddie is not going to show up, maybe, right?
Right.
So
that makes sense. Or it's not as drastic.
Baseline. Yeah, you want to control your baseline a little bit. You want to make sure that it's a quiet room. It doesn't have a bunch of people moving in and out of it, that the person has enough time to have already been sitting there and getting acclimated. They're not scared that they've just been wired up and they're sitting with a stranger. All those sorts of things. You want to make sure the baseline is a true baseline.
That's a good point. And I think that ties in really nicely with this idea of the acclimation period, because if you are getting all wired up and there is, physiological measures all over you, it can be intimidating because that's not part of your normal daily experience.
Yeah.
It's important that you set aside a period of time for that body to just get acclimated and get comfortable again, and really have that resting baseline that you're seeking out.
Because you can see the picture of Allison here, someone was obviously touching her face and putting things on, and that's all weird in the moment. It goes away quickly, right? So it's not like you have to wait a long time. I mean, honestly, people forget that they have these wires on them. We've had people accidentally wear electrodes home,
Not often, but it's more
happen.
It's the sticker, like the
stickers, to it. Sometimes
and
people forget.
Yes, exactly. Or you remind them and they're shocked that they forgot it, because when they think back to initially putting that on in the novel experience, it was something that was, it was new and they were a little bit more cautious about it. And then once they're going through the exposure and they have that acclimation period, it's that you get pretty comfortable with, and it might as well just be another similar to how you forget that you're wearing clothes all the time because it's just you're used to that experience.
Yeah,
So,
habituation, right? And
yeah.
you also want to think that, any movement that you do is going to change what your heart rate is. So if we're measuring things like heart rate or GSR, if the person, ran from their car, they were running late, or even not at all, just walking from their car into the facility, as soon as they sit down, it's going to take a second for their heart rate to come back to normal.
Right. Maybe that's walk up a flight of stairs to go to the top, to where the room is. You never really know. So it is just to get back to that resting baseline. And then you can use that as a measure to, like you said, compare to.
Yeah. And, I think another convincing argument to have a proper baseline done is that if you want to see an actual effect, then you should do your best to ensure that you have a real baseline, because otherwise you're not going to, again, find that signal to noise ratio, right? So if you can make sure that everything is as base as possible, then you have more chance of finding these points up here.
It's a really great point.
All right, so let's explore what does benchmarking really entail? What does it mean? Tell us what we got here.
Yeah, so it's really, let's talk about what a benchmark is. And it's an assessment of, an industry standard or a best practice, or even, a competitor could be considered a benchmark. And having that standard, in a sense, I know Michelle had kind of touched on it, it is the desired form of doing things. So it's like that benchmark is something that maybe you're emulating to, and you really want to hit that benchmark. So you really want to hit that standard that you're seeking out. And, you can have these internal benchmarks there, we have it listed here that it can be a comparison between products. It can be a comparison between promotional activities that you have going on, maybe just different packages, or even, even comparing packages that you have a specific package for the United States, but in the UK you have a completely different style package based on that traffic. Right. So it's you can even have it within group for an organization. And
so a lot of times we get questions about, like, what should the internal benchmark be, or what should the external benchmark be? And so when we look at it is aspirational, right? To kind of use some of the words we've been throwing around here. So if you're going to have an internal benchmark, it could be your best performer. So if you are a skincare company and you are making moisturizers, and you have lots of moisturizers you make, and you have a new prototype coming out, you might want to make sure that it is at least as good as your best performer.
Right.
But you also want to make sure it's going to perform well in the market. So you want to find out, okay, who's my biggest competition out there? Who do I want to be close to beating, right?
Yeah.
So you have an idea of how it's going to work out there in the wild.
Absolutely. And I think answering those questions does take some time of reflection on what you are prioritizing for this particular research, So, and just to touch on it really quickly, that idea of that external benchmark, it's really doing comparisons of organizational performances across an industry. So it's external to what you're used to. So again, it's that idea of those, like that industry standard that maybe you are seeking out to make sure that you're meeting it. And, benchmarks are really important for both deciding a positive or a negative, implication of something.
We definitely have, it's important to do, because it really does help our clients make real business decisions. Because again, if you go in, without comparing to anything, you just want to see how people like a product, you can get that. You can see again that they get a 6 out of 7. But, to take an action and to make a real business decision, do I need to put a lot of marketing money into this to make it work? How long should I do that for? You get a better idea of what sort of business decisions you have to make by seeing how it compares with other things that are in the market.
Exactly. And I think that is a really great point. Over here, we do have a vidcast from season 1 on doing brand tracking, and people use that very frequently to try to have that pulse where you can check in and say, are we comfortable with where we are right now? comparison to, the rest of the industry.
And that's kind of the difference that you might talk about with communications versus, what you might see with a product test, right? So with a product test, it might just be a singular moment that we just want to see how it compares to your competitors or to an internal benchmark. But if we're talking about a time course, where you want to see how the communication, the media marketing that you did is performing over time, then it is important to start with the benchmark, right? And the benchmark is that first time period to see, it's your baseline. It's to say, is it getting better or worse? Or do we need to change our communication because it's not working anymore? A year out, it's sort of gotten stale or whatever it might be. You can have like a threshold basically to decide, when we need to cut it.
Yeah, that exactly. And I think that's a great point to bring up, that you can do, it's not always going to be perfect. You're not going to be always you might strive for that benchmark, but if you have a threshold that you are trying to hit and maybe you aren't hitting it, it's a point for you to decide, where are these problems? How can we analyze them and really determine that company performance that you're seeking out to improve it? And then, integrate that so that you can get that best practice.
Yeah, get that data behind the decision making, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what do we have here?
Yeah, so honestly, just tying everything together, it's this idea of just connecting the dots and getting an understanding of what are you seeking out. It's, again, we've touched on this quite a few times at this point, where it's important for you to consider what you're really interested in comparing, because that is how you're going to ultimately decide what your findings are based on whatever you're comparing. And, what do you do when you have all this information with your comparisons? It's after you analyze everything, you want to make sure that you're using things that are significant. You want to look at it and really decide, okay, there is a change here. Why is that change there? How did it get there? And at least from the perspective, from measuring something maybe from psychophysiologically, you want to think about what was the circumstances that we had and that we controlled for, but also what didn't we control for that might be causing whatever response that they had.
But is it even a meaningful change? So
yeah,
a blip in the graph, is it something that was big enough to even consider? And that's, again, why you have to have that benchmark, because you can, or that baseline, because you want to measure that variability in that baseline, because if the variability is this big and your blip only went this high, then it's probably not meaningful, right?
Yeah, I mean, they could have sneezed. You never know.
It could be. And so you just want to make sure that you do these things, you have these baselines, you have these benchmarks, because that's how you know that you're data driven and that it's meaningful. So it's not just eyeballing something and making an opinion about it. Opinions are like, as they say, right? So instead of going off of opinion and preference, using the data to its advantage and doing the right analyses to show meaningful changes, meaningful differences that can direct real actionable business decisions.
Absolutely. And that's also where the value in comparing what you see from maybe a qualitative thing and comparing it with that quantitative. It's combining the two ideas so that way you can put together a full story and understand that context and really, like you said, get meaningful information that really tells what is happening in that experience.
Yeah, gives data shape. And that's definitely what's important when we think about data analytics, whether it's big data or small data, whatever it is that you're dealing with. Data is amorphous until you give it shape. And so you got to do these sort of things to do successful research.
Agreed.
So this was a pretty simple one, pretty straightforward. I hope that you can like this video and please subscribe to this channel so you can get the latest updates whenever we upload new episodes. Thank you so much for joining us, and please feel free to make a comment if you have any questions or have any thoughts about what we talked about today, or if you have ideas of topics that you would like to hear more about. We're happy to entertain any of those as well. You can comment on them below, or you can email us directly, or you can visit our LinkedIn, or you can tweet with us, or you can visit our blog and see what it is that we're up to, because we're up to all sorts of crazy things all the time. and we try to write about it and keep everybody up to date. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. And like Michelle said, any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is here below. I think she covered basically all of our social media locations. So feel free to engage with us. We are thrilled that you stuck around, and until next time.
Until next time. Bye, everybody.